last 2 days, we were pondering over the various questions of development in a developing economy like India. This session, we would be discussing and having a discourse on inclusiveness and development strategies. We have with us the prominent personality in gender economics and development economics, Dr. Mridu Leepan, Honorary Fellow at the Center for Development Studies and the former member of Kerala State Planning Board to chair the session. A hearty welcome to you, ma'am. We also have with us the prolific speaker, Professor R. Ramakumar, from the School of Development Studies, TISS, Mumbai, to address us on microfinance for the poor in India. I extend a hearty welcome to Professor R. Ramakumar to this event. We have two presentations in this session. I warmly welcome Dr. Manju S. Nair, Head Department of Economics, University of Kerala, and Mr. Siddiq Rabia, Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, University of Kerala, for the same. Finally, with immense pleasure, I welcome all the academicians, scholars and students gathered here. Welcome you all once again. Thank you.
I request Mridu ma'am to start the proceedings.
I think let's start immediately because we are running almost half an hour late. So the pattern is going to be the main speaker for half an hour and the other two speakers for 15 minutes each. And we try to have about 20 minutes of discussion. That's the pattern. Let's see how it goes. Now let me just have a quick 2-minute introduction. One is that I am really happy to be here. The session so I'm actually substituting for someone else, but still I feel it's a big part to me because I feel this whole project of the University Center for Economics is very, very exciting. And I think it has, as I was mentioning, and as I think been advised by everybody, it has to be taken very seriously. Not just thinking of neoclassical economics, but for all other types of economics which actually did come in the sense of Amartya sense development economics or the institutional economics, how much we can take from them, or what are the alternatives that we have in mind. So to have the alternatives in mind, we should be very thorough with what has been happening in the field of economics, whether neoclassical or whether some of the improvements, or rather improvements in the sense of addressing reality much more, was being undertaken by so many people. Now, what is the theme of this session? It's inclusiveness. And I think this is probably the most challenging of all the analysis that we can think of in terms of challenging conventional macroeconomic analysis. Because macroeconomic analysis and policy has been actually a complete disjuncture with social policy, and there is need to integrate macroeconomic policy with social policy. I think that is the most important thing, because not only because of globalization and its aggressive impact on the poorer people and the whole issue of social exclusion that we talk about, even in the earlier state-led industrialization processes, because development was supposed to trickle down to each and everybody, social policy was treated as a residual. So if people are not included in the process of development, what little tinkering can we do for those sections of people who have not been able to gain from development? So social policy has always been treated as an add-on to macroeconomic policy, but the challenge is, how do we mainstream social policy into macroeconomic analysis, which also means that we have to rethink on macroeconomic analysis. I think that's the biggest challenge. So let me stop here and request Dr. Ramakumar to make his presentation on microfinance.
Thank you for that introduction. I think Mridu very correctly put it as a question of the interface between mainstream macroeconomics and social policy. You also brought in the question of inclusion here, which is very important today, because we always hear about the question of financial inclusion in today's public policy. And that provides me a very nice entry point to what I want to talk about today, which is related to financial inclusion. And within financial inclusion, a very important component part has been the question of microcredit. Now, in the little time that I have, about half an hour that I have, let me quickly take you through what I want to say. If you look at the title of my presentation, it's about microfinance for the poor, the choice between two models. So I'm obviously sort of counterposing two models of microfinance provision in this argument. And I'm going to, of course, privilege one over the other. And my job over the next 30 minutes is to argue out why one needs to be privileged over the other. Let's first talk about microcredit and not microfinance, and I'll come to microfinance a little later. If you look at what microcredit implies, microcredit implies micro, so small loans. But then what's new about small loans? Small loans have always been a part of the history of rural and urban credit provision in the history of the world. So there's nothing new about the smallness of microcredit, which actually distinguishes it. So then what distinguishes microcredit? Microcredit is distinguished by the core element of its provision, which is the absence of a physical collateral. The absence of a physical collateral, which is substituted by a social collateral, often also called as peer monitoring, is the core distinguishing feature of microcredit as it is practiced across the world. Here again, however, it's not a new concept. If you look at Jonathan Swift's Irish loan funds of 1700s of the 18th century, you will see that small loans were provided under those funds without collateral to poor borrowers. So that's nothing new, even when we speak about loans without collateral. If you also look at the large number of savings and credit institutions that have prevailed across Asia and Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, many of them were also provided without taking any collateral. So that's nothing new about it. Nothing new about it. But the current model of microcredit, which has come into world attention, is largely a product of the 1970s, mainly after 1975, when Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel Peace Prize winning economist from Bangladesh, began or started a small bank, which was called the Grameen Bank, in the village of Jogra, in the Chittagong district of Bangladesh. That's where he was working as a professor in the Department of Economics. So that is the beginning of the emergence of microcredit as an idea. Why is it famous? It's in a sense attained some kind of a celebrity status in the social policy literature. In 2005, it was called the International Year of Microcredit, and the brand ambassador was Aishwarya Rai. So that's the kind of celebrity status that microcredit has suddenly attained. If you ask Muhammad Yunus, the founder of Grameen Bank, what is the utility of Grameen Bank or microcredit, he is going to tell you that it's about creating a process that will send poverty to the museum. Okay, so send poverty to the museum. In the sense, in the point that he's making is, if you can ensure, elsewhere he has made this point, that if you can ensure that somebody gets poor people get loan at affordable interest rate and at the right time, then you can be assured that poverty will not last long. So there's a premise that Yunus is building here, or built here, which is that if you provide the imperfections in the credit market are the primary and fundamental reasons for the presence of poverty, and transcending those imperfections will actually send poverty to the museum. That's the kind of a premise which Muhammad Yunus laid out when he was asked questions regarding what is the utility of microcredit. But my point in this presentation is to go a little deeper into this question. So is there anything that is conceptually deeper here, particularly given that the period in which microcredit has risen to fame in this world is also the period in which financial liberalization has been implemented with a lot of ferocity across developing and developed countries. So is there a link between financial liberalization and microcredit? Or why is it that financial liberalization is undisturbed by, or unperturbed rather, by the coming in of microcredit as an important policy related to credit provision for the poor? And therein, I try to create this link which I want to argue out in this whole paper. I argue here that there are two areas in which there is there is enormous compatibility between policies of financial liberalization and the question of microcredit provision. The first is that in the period of financial liberalization, what we have seen across the developed and developing world is a withdrawal of the state or the public banks from credit provision to the poor as well as the rural areas. That has been a trend across the world. Now, in this vacuum that is created by the withdrawal of state institutions from public credit provision, you have seen microcredit coming in as an alternative, as a substitute, because microcredit is largely private credit provision, which is seen as an effective substitute for the provision of credit to the poor, particularly in an era where public banks are withdrawing from credit provision to the poor. That's point number one. So it's seen as an effective substitute for public banking to lend to the poor. The second point that I want to raise is a sub point of the first, which is that if you take one of the, and I think this is the core element of microcredit, which has ultimately led to its demise or enormous discrediting that it has been subjected to in the last few years, which is the core element of financial liberalization being interest rate liberalization. And with respect to this element of financial liberalization, that is interest rate deregulation, microfinance sits very comfortably with the larger policy framework that financial liberalization lays out. In these two senses, A, as a substitute for public banking, and B, as something which dovetails the larger policy under financial liberalization of interest rate deregulation, microfinance and financial liberalization sits very comfortably with each other. That's the point that I want to make, and I want to make the point at the end of it that this is the reason why microfinance has failed in the dominant version in which it has been implemented, and the reason why it has been successful in certain cases like Kerala has been because there has been a disconnect between the provision of microcredit and the larger policy framework that financial liberalization puts forward. That's the point that I want to make in this short presentation that I want to give. So let's come to this. Let's come to a slightly conceptual point. What does the neoclassical model of credit provision tell us? What does the neoclassical, particularly rural credit provision for the poor, tell us? Basically, the assumption here is that everybody faces the same interest rate. Everybody has to face the same interest rate if market's clear. If demand and supply of credit is clear, everybody has. There's only one interest rate in the economy. Poor, rich, large, small, everybody should face the same interest rate because credit should immediately move into areas where interest rate is high and push down the interest rates. So that's supposed to be the assumption here. However, this is something that you simply do not see in any financial market across the world. Even in developed financial markets, you do not see everybody facing the same interest rate. The reason why people face differential interest rates even in a free market is because of different reasons like fragmentation and segmentation of the credit market, which I'm not going into here. But the point here is there is a sizable gap between the lending rate and the deposit rate in banks, which should not be the case. Sometimes the difference between lending rate and deposit rate is far higher than the cost of credit provision itself, which means there is something more at work which raises the interest rate up at the borrower level. Second is there is a sizable range in the informal sector rates of interest that you see. Informal rates of interest can vary in the same village from 30% to 120%. It should not be the case if financial markets actually clear within the informal sector, not between the public and the private sector, but within the private sector itself, within the informal sector itself, you see a very large range of interest rates prevailing, which should not be the case. Even within the informal sector, within the same social groups, within the same occupational category, for the same task that you give a loan, for the same purpose that you give loans to, you see a variation of interest rates. It can vary from 40% to 120% there. So the idea that everybody faces the same interest rate simply does not come true in the empirical evidence that you see from the field. Now, there's also other class-wise variations also, because rich people borrow larger loans and face lower interest rates, and poor people borrow smaller loans and face higher interest rates. So all these variations exist. It's absolutely not true that everybody faces the same interest. Now, new institutional economics came with an answer to this question, which is that everybody do face the same interest rate. It's not correct that everybody does not face the same interest rate. Everybody faces the same interest rate. It's just that you have to add something here, which is that everybody faces the same risk-adjusted interest rate. Now, if you add the element of risk into the provision of credit, you will actually see that the higher interest rates that the poor are paying out is actually because giving loans to them attracts a higher risk premium compared to giving loans to the richer people who are likely to repay quicker and faster and more promptly. Because poor people, with poor people, there is an element of default which runs very high. The risk of default runs very high. Your money lenders and even public banks sometimes are forced to jack up interest rates to cover for the risk that might be involved in recovering the amount of money that from after giving the loan. As a result, the high interest rates that you see from the informal sector, money lenders charging 120%, is not actually a sign of exploitation. It is actually just a sign of the market clearing after taking account for the risk element that is involved in provision of credit for the poor. So that was the argument of economists like Anthony Bottomley and all in the 1960s and 1970s, which came to be very well accepted in the dominant economic circles. So here, so then why do public banks not give credit to the poor? Of course, that's another empirical fact that's in front of us. Public banks do not give credit to those people who do not offer a collateral, and poor people typically do not have collateral. So in this argument, the reason why public banks do not give credit to the poor are because they cannot handle three problems. One is a problem of targeting. Right? The problem of targeting means that how can you ensure while providing credit to the poor that there is no error of inclusion or an error of exclusion? In other words, in a program to lend to the poor, how do you ensure that the rich do not end up getting the loan, or the poor get excluded from the provision of the loan? How do you ensure that these two? Suppose you have a scheme to an IRDP-like scheme that you had in the 1980s, where specifically poverty alleviation is the objective of the scheme. How do you ensure that the credit primarily goes to the poor and not somebody else? That's problem number one. Public banks can't find out who is poor and who is not poor. There is no appropriate way of identification, so they end up giving credit to nobody, and hence poor are left unbanked. Second is a question of screening. Here, the public banks face the question of how to differentiate between credit-worthy borrowers and non-credit-worthy borrowers. Because public banks do not have adequate resources to find out who is credit-worthy, who is not credit-worthy, because poor people do not keep credit records or balance sheets of their activities and so on, it's impossible for the banks to distinguish between credit-worthy and non-credit-worthy. At the end of it, they give loans to nobody. So hence the poor are left unbanked. The third problem that they face after targeting and screening is the question of monitoring. How do you ensure that the loans that are given to the poor are put to the right purpose for which they are given? Now this is another question, because only if you give to production and they use it for consumption, there is no return from it, and hence they end up not repaying the loan. So how do you figure out this problem? Now, these three problems are seen by new institutional economics as the three main reasons why public banks historically have left the poor unbanked. Right? Now, how do you handle this? That is how the role of microcredit comes in at the conceptual level. It is argued here that the first problem of targeting can be resolved by making the credit loan amount so small that the rich will not be interested in it. Okay? If you give a loan of 500 rupees, the poor will not, the richer people will not come and take the trouble of coming and taking that loan. You also create weekly repayment meetings in the sites of credit provision, and the rich will not take the trouble of coming to the weekly meetings and so on. Put some eligibility conditions. All these can be used by microfinance agencies to resolve the question of targeting. Number two, the question of screening. How do you resolve the question of screening? That is the differentiation of creditworthy and non-creditworthy borrowers. Here is where the idea of group lending comes in. Basically, you lend to groups, and Eunice's classic idea was you ask a group of 5 people to come in, and then first you give loans to only 2 people. You watch the repayment pattern, and then once they repay appropriately for 6 months, give the third and fourth person the loan. And when the third and fourth also repay, you give the loan to the fifth person, who is also the convener of the group. Right? So in this way, you ensure that peer monitoring works. The convener has the biggest responsibility now to ensure that the first, second, third, and fourth person repays the loan. And this is how the idea of screening creditworthiness is supposed to be thrust upon the system of credit provision in the scheme of microcredit. And also you are asking, you are assuming that groups will be like-minded in the sense that you ask them to form the group and come to you, and not you go out and form the group. So if you ask people to form the group and then come to you, you can be assured in some sense that they will be belonging to the same socioeconomic category, group, and so on. That's another reason why microcredit can help in reducing screening costs. Monitoring, you have weekly meetings, you have frequent site visits by the employees of the microfinance firm and so on. Through these site visits and so on, you can actually ensure monitoring. In other words, microfinance is not simply the provision of small loans and the absence of collateral. It involves a large number of activities which are linked before and after. Involves targeting to begin with, screening of course, and then monitoring also, right up to the stage of repayment. In other words, there are a lot of activities that come in which are not usually seen in a typical method of credit, in a typical process of credit provision that you see otherwise. Now, this is the reason why it is argued that microcredit is good and it is important. Now, it's a good idea. Obviously, if you are a hard-nosed public banker, you will obviously not give loans to people who are supposed to be non-creditworthy. You would like to have high repayment rates. That's every hard-nosed banker would like to ensure high repayment rates. And in that sense, I'm not somebody who's going to dumb down the idea of peer monitoring, the importance of peer monitoring, and the reasons why social collateral is actually a very good idea to follow in the provision of credit to the poor. So it's a very interesting idea as an idea. Now the question is how it is implemented. It's implemented all across the world. There are supposed to be 133 million people across the world who have been touched by microcredit in one form or the other. There are, according to the Mixed Market database, which is a self-reported database of microfinance companies, you are actually 93 million people across the world who have been involved with some kind of microcredit provision. And the average loan size for microcredit is seen as something like $500 for a household, for one borrower. That's the scale and level at which microcredit has spread across the world. Now the question that comes is the hype justified? I spoke about International Year of Microcredit. I spoke about poverty the claims related to poverty being sent to the museum and so on. So is the hype justified? That's the question that we need to face next. The answer to this question from my side is no. There has not been one solid evidence-based study which actually shows that microcredit has substantially increased the incomes of the poor, other than through very fallacious assumptions of ceteris paribus. In other words, one of the major methodological problems that you face in evaluating microcredit is that you ultimately have to employ a before and after method. What was it before? What is it after? When you employ a before and after method, people who are involved in quantitative surveys will tell you that it's nothing as nightmarish as employing a before and after method, particularly when you are collecting incomes. You are going to ask a poor person what was their income 6 years back, right? And you are absolutely sure that you will get a wrong answer, right? And memory biases and other biases creep in, and you will not get a robust answer to such questions. You basically have to have some kind of panel data to look at how households and their incomes have changed over a period of time, and such data is very rarely available. And no such data has been used to argue out that microcredit has substantially increased the incomes of the poor. In a very interesting review article that came in the Journal of Economic Literature, Princeton economist Jonathan Modak, who's actually otherwise who's very positive about potential of microcredit, argues that while strong claims are made for the ability of microfinance to reduce poverty, only a handful of studies use sizable samples and appropriate frameworks to answer that question. As a result, even the most fundamental claims remain unsubstantiated. Okay? So there isn't a very good study that has come out on the global scale, it actually shows that microcredit has substantially increased the incomes of the poor. However, it has been shown to have a positive impact on the poor, of course, but the related point that has been made, it is at best called as a weak survival strategy for the poor, particularly given the high voltage poverty that they face in their everyday life. So is the hype justified? Probably not. That's the answer that we can give, at least tentatively, at this point of time. But why? Why is it that you do not find studies which actually, even when they use interesting methodologies, why is it that you do not find microcredit as increasing household incomes in a substantive way? And that is where I come back to the point that I made, which is its links with financial liberalization, its links with some of the core principles of financial liberalization somehow ensure that it does not benefit the poor beyond a particular point. And that's then the remaining time that I have, I'm going to spend on that particular point. Now, if you look at Mohammad Yunus, and if you ask him about his view on the, or rather his worldview within which he introduced the idea of microcredit in Bangladesh, he will tell you in his book Banker to the Poor, which was published in 1999, he argues that the Grameen model of microcredit can be effective only in a capitalist and free market driven economy. Okay, that's the worldview from which Yunus comes from. He argues, and I quote Yunus here, "I do believe in the power of the global free market economy and using capitalist tools. I believe in the power of free market and the power of capital in the marketplace. I believe in the central thesis of capitalism, that the economic system must be competitive and it must be profit maximizing." Right? So this is the worldview from which Yunus is coming from. Yunus is not not somebody who's trying to create an alternative or post-capitalist or anti-capitalist alternative to a particular problem that capitalism has. He's trying to make life a little better within capitalism and accepting the basic tenets of capitalism in the first place. In this context, it is not at all surprising that microcredit follows. The policy on microcredit across the world has followed the policy of financial liberalization. Example, take the question of interest rates. Right? Across the world, if you see, so I just mentioned a little while back about how neoclassical models see in the question of interest rate. High interest rates for them are just a reflection of higher amounts of risk that are involved in the provision of credit to the poor. Now, if you look at it in this sense, it is argued also in the same theoretical framework, you will see the argument coming out that any subsidizing of interest rates, right, any regulation of interest rates will actually lead to the phenomenon of financial repression. Okay? Financial repression is seen as a phenomenon, and students of economics will know it immediately, which is that it is seen as a sort of upper floor laid for interest rates to rise. Interest rates cannot rise if the state comes in and sets an upper floor for the interest rates to prevail. And as a result, what happens is savings rate and investment rates fall significantly, and economic growth as a consequence falls. That is the argument of the financial repression model, which was put forward in 1973 by two economists, McKinnon and Shaw. Now, these arguments have been raised that subsidizing interest rates create financial repression, reduces savings rate, reduces investment rate, and creates poor economic growth, and that higher interest rates are not a problem. Higher interest rates are just a reflection of higher risks that are involved in giving credit to the poor. These two principles have been invoked to argue for conditions of policies across the world where microcredit remains divorced from any state regulation, divorced from any interest rate regulation that the state or public policy would like to bring in as into the provision of credit to the poor. So there are risks. There is a risk involved in giving credit to the poor. There are costs involved in giving credit to the poor. As a result, do not regulate the sphere of interest rates related to giving credit to the poor. This is something that the Reserve Bank of India and the NABARD in India have actually concurred while they have looked at the question of microcredit. I'll read out a small quote from NABARD in 1997. Really? Okay. The Reserve Bank of India says freedom from poverty is not for free. The poor are willing and are capable to pay the cost. Right? Freedom from poverty is not free, and the poor are willing and capable to pay the cost. It is this framework in which microcredit has been introduced in India. Now, what is this framework? As a result of this policy, what you have is that the average interest rates on microcredit agencies in India fall between 24 to 36%. That's the average interest rate that prevails on microcredit provision in India as a whole, 24 to 36%. There are 60, 70%. The average is between this rate. Then you get a car loan for 8%. So a home loan for 9% and so on. So this is officially deregulated because it is assumed that this difference can remain, and this difference can remain because there is a cost involved in giving credit to the poor. There is also a risk involved in giving credit to the poor, and both needs to be factored in while you fix the interest rate. Now, when Grameen Bank policy came to be implemented in India, there were two models. I come to the title of my presentation, which is that there are two models. One is called the SHG Bank Linkage Program. The SHG Bank Linkage Program meant that public banks enter into that was actually a very new thing to do in 1991. Public banks give credit to an NGO or directly to self-help groups. The NGOs go and form a self-help group, and then credit provision goes on, which is actually the Kudumbashree model that you see in Kerala. Public banks and cooperatives entering credit provision via NGOs or via self-help groups and so on. Now, the other model that prevailed was actually not something that came up. It is not something that came in 1991. It came much later, around 1998, 99, and so on, where private players began entering the sphere of microcredit provision. There were non-profit NGOs which basically came. SKS, Spandana, all these were microcredit agencies of the non-profit nature. NGOs who came in using donor money, using small capital that is put together from different sources. They came into the provision of microcredit as a parallel alternative in 1999, 2000 and so on. It is at the same time that RBI deregulated interest rates for them for microcredit provision, and they could use this policy to raise interest rates and charge as much of interest rate from the poor. That freedom was given, and a parallel model, which was a private NGO-led model of microcredit provision, was actively encouraged by public policy in the period 1999 onwards. It is this that explodes by the end of 2000s in the way in which SKS or Ramakumar's SKS company actually burst after they went into the IPO and so on. What is the core problem here? When you are not dependent on banks, look at the way in which they proceed. You start from being a non-profit NGO, and then you want to become a for-profit NBFC, non-banking financial company. So it is this transition that you are looking at. This transition from a non-profit NGO to a for-profit NBFC. In this transition, there are three stages. One, if you are a small company, some bank will give you a loan. But if you are a 200-300 crore capital requiring company, then you go to the Rashtriya Mahila Kosh, or you go to the SIDBI, Small Industrial Development Bank of India, and you take a loan of 200-300 crore to fund your credit operations. But then, as you slowly move from microcredit to microfinance, you also provide savings instruments, you also provide insurance instruments and so on. The capital that you require is much more. 200-300 crore will not be adequate. So as companies expand, you basically move from small capital requirement to high capital requirement. So 200-300 crore is not enough. So you go to 500 crore. When you reach 500 crore, what you actually need is private equity capital. Right? So you go to equity investors, you go to angel investors, you go to venture capitalists, and so on, and you begin asking for money. But then these are not angels. They are looking to make quick profits with their investment. For example, take the company, venture capitalist firm called Catamaran. It is owned by N.R. Narayana Murthy of Infosys. N.R. Narayana Murthy went and invested in SKS. He bought 1.5% share in SKS with 28 crore. In 6 months, his profit became 64 crore. Okay, that's the kind of profit you are looking at. Okay, 15%, 20% return is what these venture capitalists are looking for in this kind of provision. So when you are at 500 crore, then you go to these equity investors and you constantly have to show them higher yields. You have to show them higher profits. Otherwise, the investment will fall in these companies. As a result, but then your costs don't fall, your costs are very high. Technology can help only reducing costs at the margins. So even the costs cannot fall because microcredit is essentially an expensive model of credit provision. As costs cannot fall, you basically have to rely on only one instrument to keep your yield rates high so that equity investors will be constantly interested in you, which is interest. Okay? As a result, these firms have constantly raised interest rates. Private NGOs have actually raised interest rates on the provision of microcredit in order to ensure that their investors remain happy. And this, I feel, is in my argument, this is a systemic failure of the model. This model is fundamentally unsuitable to give credit to the poor, primarily because it has to constantly show higher profits to please its private investors. Okay? This is not the case with the other model, and I end with this. This is not the case with the other model, which is the classic model being in Kerala, the Kudumbashri model, which is that you have public bank coming and providing the credit to the poor. State can come in and provide an interest subsidy, whereby your internal lending rate, as in Kudumbashri, can actually come down to less than 8%. I think it's less than 8%. 8% at this point of time. You can actually do that. You can actually do that because you don't need to show higher yields and higher returns to a private equity capitalist who comes and invests in your firm. And this systemic infirmity in the provision of private microcredit is the reason why that model stands completely discredited today. And the way ahead for us, in my argument here, is that the public bank-led SHG bank linkage program is the most appropriate microfinance model that we have at this point of time to give credit to the poor. However, that requires that we transcend some of the constraints that financial liberalization has put in forward. And there I come to Mridul's point of the links between macroeconomic policy and social policy. Some of these core principles of financial liberalization are actually a constraint in expanding or moving into a macroeconomic policy where social policy is firmly embedded at the center. Thank you.
The past and present, predictive future. So all of us are now aware of the fact that alternative economics are used for development policies, development thoughts, development philosophies, etc., which can be very relevant to suit particular time periods, particular places and particular cases against the one-size-fits-all policies. Development also needs to be people-centric, that is, it should be sustainable. For this purpose, we need alternative methodologies. And this is the context of my paper. My paper focuses on a very pertinent issue in the domain of development, that is large-scale environmental dispossession that is taking place across India, particularly in Kerala. And what methodology do we have to measure this dispossession, and is the methodology that we follow foolproof? Now, coming to my presentation, we know since the new liberal policy of increasing globalization and the market access, we know there has been increase in the demand for land from different sources, from industry, for resource extraction, for real estate, and all these, because of all these factors, because private capital was flowing into the country, there has been increase in the demand for land. And this has been in confrontation with the inelastic supply of land, and the Government of India amended the Land Reforms Act 1894 to provide amicable solution to this problem. And we know we have recently the Land Acquisition, Resettlement and Rehabilitation Act, and all these we have, all the laws and regulations that we have adopted have market price at the central stage of remuneration or assessing the cost of dispossession. The market price in itself is flawed, and when it becomes fundamentally flawed when we take into consideration the ecosystem services provided by different land forms. Now, what I would like to argue is that environmental dispossession to a particular individual may have a social cost to the society. And it's on the basis of this that I have framed my study objective as assessing the cost of environmental induced or development-induced dispossession, the need for an alternative methodology. And I have done a case study with reference to Valandakad Island, where the state along with the private builders are trying to seize the whole beauty of this island in the name of development. And this is the organization of my presentation. I will first try to understand the fallacy of using market prices of land as a measure of cost of dispossession and hence compensation. Secondly, I would like to argue for the need to consider the ecosystem services provided by land while acquisition is taking place. third, as I said, with respect to the mangrove land and ecosystem environment. Now, as I said, the million-dollar question is how should landowners be compensated when state seizes private land for development projects? And the Land Reforms Act of 1894 takes up market price as a remuneration, or in particular it says that it should be the average value of the land that is transacted for the last 3 years. And recently when the government adopted this laws, now it had again market price is the base, a markup is added for the market price, above the market price. And we know this is wrought with lots and lots of problems. In rural areas the transactions are very few and not well documented. So there's a chance of always fake deeds to be produced and then market price being fixed on the basis of that. And again in rural areas, lot of sales, land sales takes place in the case of distress sales, and then the situation is also different. And if the person, the farmer, sells his land, and what happens after industrial development is that the land prices appreciate very much, and he's not in a position to get back, or to earn this increase in prices. And there are some more important concerns regarding using market price as a cost of measuring this disposition. The value of land cannot be fixed objectively by some experts. It's a subjective quantity. It's whatever the owner seems or deems it to be. And again, there is an issue of heterogeneity among owners in valuation. Now, if a farmer is educated, if he has some other source of income, then he may be having different value, giving different value to his land. And again, there are many other potential values, including land acts as a collateral, it increases social prestige, it's a source of employment for family labor, and transaction takes place when the owner of the land meets another person who values this land more than the owner of the land, and only then there can be a market transaction. But when you say that there is no transaction or there is no need for any, the owner is not willing to sell his land, it means that current owners value this asset more than the prevailing market price. Now in such a situation, if land is forcibly seized, market price would definitely be a serious underestimate. But now I'm coming to my argument. The land, is definitely highly heterogeneous. You classify it into different categories. Now one major or categorization is between wetland and the drylands, and the market price, when you think about these type of land forms, the ecosystem services or the environmental values that these land provide are not at all reflected in the market price of land. Now, and what are the ecosystem services that land provides? Now, these are the conditions and process through which the natural ecosystem and the species that make up sustain and fulfill human life. They maintain biodiversity and production of ecosystem goods such as seafood, forage, timber, biomass fuels, natural fiber, and many pharmaceutical, industrial products, etc. This is from the Millennium Ecosystem Service definition, and means that the ecosystem goods and services that natural capital or land provide represent the benefits human populations derive directly or indirectly from ecosystem function. It includes the provisioning services that the products obtained from the ecosystem, including food and fiber, fuel, genetic resources, biochemicals, ornamental resources, fresh waters, etc. Now, this is very important, the regulating services that the particular type of land or natural capital can provide: air quality maintenance, climate regulation, water regulation, erosion control, pollination, storm protection, water purification, waste treatment, etc. Then the cultural services, that is spiritual enrichment and the cognitive development that we get, diversity, spiritual and religious values, knowledge systems, inspiration, aesthetic values, social relations, recreations, and ecotourism. And more importantly, the supporting services that's necessary for production of other ecosystem services, including the production of atmospheric oxygen, soil formation and retention, nutrient cycle, water cycling, etc. And we should understand that these ecosystem services that land provide are very much related to the constituents of human well-being also. It provides, listing out the points, it provides you security, it provides you basic materials for good life, it provides you health. That's very important, feeling well, access to clean water and air, good social relations, and finally the freedom of choice and action, that's opportunity to be able to achieve what an individual values doing and being. That's what is fundamental. Now, this argument necessitates a need for an integrated assessment regarding the values created by ecosystems, and this helps in informed decision making when investments are appraised, activities are formed, or planned policies are formulated. Now, usually we go for only a livelihood assessment when land is encroached by for the state or the private capitals, and that too, it has lot of problems. What we need is that you need to have an ecosystem assessment, a biodiversity assessment, and more than that, and also an economic assessment, and this will provide necessary data when land is secured for developmental purposes. Now I'll come to the case study that I have done in Valandakad Island. Now it's a wetland system characterized by mangroves. I need not explain the ecosystem services provided by the mangroves. Now capitalists treat these mangroves as, term it as basements. That is what popular media popularizes, and hence it is easily acquired by them at low prices, and either it's destroyed and then resold, or then otherwise the waterlands are filled with soil, and then it is used for all types of construction purposes. And mangroves in Ernakulam has been largely destructed because of the Valapadam LNG terminal, Fisheries Research Station, International Cricket Stadium, etc. And you have the conflicting situation of marginalized low-income resource poor landowners trying to protect the ecosystem, while the owners of larger holdings trying to destroy the mangroves. Now it's a 240 acres pristine island, means of people are so contented there. I cannot explain that because of lack of time. And the private builder, the Shobha Group, has taken away, purchased 200 acres of land and violating all the laws under 18 names. And they are planning for a 4 crore square feet. That's a 500 crore investment in knowledge park, commercial complex, start hotels, IT, research, etc. 50 families are occupying the remaining portion, and all of them belong to the AC group. And the local people who used to have a very peaceful life, now these are the photos. Now suddenly what they saw is that people descending on the island and cutting up all the mangroves. They gathered for a powerful collective action, and they had support from the environmentalists. And the irony of that is that the builders are offering these people 500 rupees per cent or a flat. And what will these people do? 50,000 rupees per cent or a flat. And what I argue is that let our government fix the compensation on the basis of environmental values. This is the methodology by which we value all the environmental services. And this is the value of the ecosystem service that is provided by the island. It comes to around 10960 per hectare, that is around 50 crores. Ecosystem services will be perpetually generated for 1 year. It's perpetually generated by mangroves. This is a demand supply function. This is the brown portion is the producer surplus, and the other is the consumer surplus, which the total portion is taken as the economic value. But for a natural asset, the consumer surplus, it is not being limited. Once the supply reduces, the consumer surplus is going to increase. And in this situation, now how do you find out it's going to perpetuate for the ecosystem services provided by this area is going to perpetuate for a long number of years. Now, how do you find the value in the present year? Should we go for compounding or discounting? That's a question. Anyway, if it remains for the next 70 years, maybe a child who is 1 year old, he lives for around 70 years, that is the average life expectancy of a airline, it will provide 5,000 crores. And this is the immense value which is not reflected in the market price. If ecosystem services were actually paid for in terms of the value compensation contribution, the compensation price of land would be very different from it as of now. And it not only result in manifold increase in the price of land, but it will also distract, or it will it will hinder all these developmental activities, the so-called developmental activities that are going to take place. And I was interested in this island after reading Aarti by Sarah Joseph, which has been translated by Wilson Tambur, The Gift in Green. This novel is placed on the Valandakad Island, and she has given the island a name Aarti, that's the beginning, an idyllic village where a green bamboo that nourishes and protects a world of life forms, both human and animal. It's about how the gift in green is ravaged in name of development, especially when it disrespects ecological balance. The novel raises several questions. What is development that is insensitive to environment? Where are we dumping our waste? Where are we headed in the name of progress? What are we doing all about this? And it starts with the pristine world of environment and the wild bushes around everything. Then everywhere in the novel is the remainder of man's brutality in the name of progress. Now, to quote Sarah Joseph, how can the votaries of market economy who are conditioned to see everything doing calculations of profit or loss be expected to understand Aarti or see its points of contact with the world in which we live? We are fast losing the emotional and mental tools for recognizing the extent to which the radical, perhaps ruinous changes in the last 5 or 6 decades have petrified us. So to conclude, no matter how deeply it is buried and how many layers of dust shroud it, somewhere in the depth of every person's being, there will be a handful of moisture. Let us rediscover it and work for true development.
Please show your photographs, that would be interesting for people to see.
This is the photo. Now it's a place where you may be having 10 cents of land and 10 cents of a small pond or water body. And the people there are focusing on their livelihood is based on fishing activity. Now the women, they go in the morning, they use this mold, that vanji, and then they go for, now I asked them how many rupees, how many, they collect what is called perimine. Now we have asked them how many, what is the amount of perimine that you collect, and they told us it is only for rupees 300. Now then we asked us, no, why don't you collect more? Then she was asking us the question, we need only this much. Then why do you go for collecting or catching more fish? Now, people like me, maybe we don't understand what those people may mean by this, but this is the basics of sustainable livelihood or sustainable ecosystem management. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Very interesting. May I now ask Siddiq to take a presentation?
About one of you. So, good afternoon all. Chair, Professor Liberalization, Professor Ramakumar, Dr. Manjush Nayak, dignitaries on and off the dais, and friends. So actually I have a dilemma, in fact, to present what? Because it is a long paper. It is having two aspects. One is the theoretical concern and the second one is an empirical concern. So I would like to actually stick upon the theoretical to the conceptual concern. So that was actually I finalized today. So I am going to speak strictly in this slide because otherwise I may not be actually running out of time. So in the outset, the development. Now the development is actually the theme of the thing, and Ethan was already mentioned about the relevance of macroeconomic interaction or any other significant sort of thinking other than the neoclassical thing. So I would like to actually mention or start from neoclassical approach itself. So in the neoclassical approach, property right under the zero transaction cost is perfect, right? This is what actually Ronald Coase, the Nobel laureate in institutional economics, he was actually referring. Under a positive transaction cost, these perfect property rights may become shaky. This is what the argument, and I would like to actually share some of the discomfort in the neoclassical tradition and to see how we can actually have an interventionist or affirmative action based on the judiciary based or any sort of institution based system. So what are the rationale of making such an interpretation of right under zero transaction, zero and positive transaction costs, and what are the implications of this logical inference under the political situation? These questions are in fact pertinent to us, and that is what I am going to actually do today. So in the neoclassical view on a transaction cost and property right, where we have we classify the neoclassical view as two. One is property right under zero transaction cost, and the other one is property right under positive transaction cost. Property rights under zero transaction cost is earlier view of the exchange, where a property right is considered as given or perfect. This means that the neoclassical economics do not consider the cost of obtaining information about alternative and of negotiating, policing and enforcing economic exchange. Such costs are zero under a market situation where the cost of information is perfect among the players. In a similar way, they were of the view that the allocation of property right is perfect due to the cost of information and other cost of establishing and maintaining property right remain zero. So this could be help us to derive property rights transaction cost relation as they follow, which is non-conventional economic graph, where you have actually two sides, transaction cost on the other side and the property right on the. If your transaction cost is zero as per Ronald Coase said, then you have actually a perfect property right. Of course, I have dispute on this. And then if you move on having a positive transaction cost, then you may be actually having. So this is actually the difference, or what you can say the trade-off. So the early neoclassical view of the sort is built on the rationality of perfect information among the players. This information will give way to the doctrine of perfect competition with its guiding principles of profit maximizing behavior of individual. However, this has been questioned. For example, consider the compatibility of information and competition. Now what is actually competition? If two or more individuals, which is actually n is greater than 2, offer independent value, which is P, of securing a commodity X from a third person T. That is a race for securing X from T by A or B. So this is actually, in a simple way, we call a competition. It also implies that there is no cooperation in securing X from T. So that is non-cooperative. The system is actually perceived in a non-cooperative framework. And what is information symmetry on the other side? It, in a neoclassical frame, how can we define is the following, that is, as Oman defined, that is, I know that what you know and you know that what I know. So we can extend that argument ever. So in other words, information is of A is equal to B, which implies that B has all the characteristics which A has and vice versa. So if on commodity and price, the same follows as the following. So what would be the nature of competition then? Two possibilities which you can derive out of it. A, the competition with equal entitlement, and B, the competition with unequal entitlement. So what is the ultimate effect in that basic premise? The perfect competition with the symmetric information produces a static result. And I will come to what does it mean. Under such a circumstance, does property right whether perfect or imperfect matters? So why it's so? So these are the questions which we need, and along with that, such a notion seems to be puzzling or more formally to say logical topology. So why it's so? Because the resource, the possible conclusion is that because the resource transfer and its consumption take place simultaneously, or to say this does not consider the direction of the use of resources, either ex ante or ex post, which is actually time. This is the greatest criticism which is raised against this idea, which is actually the microeconomic framework is timeless. So neoclassical with the transaction laws on the other side, they are actually putting a different notion, that is the real world theoretical model characterized by the information asymmetry is quite unrealistic and little to do with any policy decisions, whereas in a later stage this asymmetric information theory gained its momentum. I'm not actually going to the reviews, and the rationality question is addressed in this term, modeling bounded rationality and limited rationality as the key factor in behavior which drives the economic decisions. However, the consideration of the concept of bounded and limited rationality is still carrying over the neoclassical hangover in economic modeling. This is what this is an important critique which we need to basically look at. So then the neoclassical economics is of the view that the transportation cost is the only cost accrued other than the cost of production due to the entire cost of production and exchange. This is how they are actually perceived. Of course, Arrow and many economists of the mainstream, they argue very vehemently on this, and under perfectly informed will, the possibility of any cost other than the cost of transportation is impossible. This is what their argument. And the concept of transportation cost is inevitable and rationalizable because the production site and the consumption sites are two different locations or two different entities. To realize the interaction of the economic process of exchange, these two have to come together and do business. So this is actually the unintegrated firm where they used to say we have actually disintegrated or actually not integrated market, non-integrated market, which is market A to N, and in individual or firm is having interaction, then you have definitely a transaction cost. Then the solution is the following: you integrate the firm. So if you horizontally or vertically integrate, then the problem will be solved. But that is not actually the concern. The view is perhaps classical because it may be better than the no transaction cost, hence transportation cost may bring the resources loss incurred due to the imperfect information or opportunism or running of the economic system as been defined. But the transportation cost definition of the transaction cost is problematic to represent the property rights creation under its conceptualization, because the transportation cost cannot etymologically coherent to accumulate many costs such as establishment of right over the resources or the enforcement cost of exercising rights or the search cost of looking for a market. Similarly, themselves note that without recognizing the cost of establishing property rights or ownership and the possession of resources to exchange, the whole process of transaction seems to be unrealistic. Now, if you look at the property right from a transaction cost, as earlier mentioned premise, then the important constraints to understand the transaction cost is its complexity to minimize invisible cost. This implies that a positive relationship between the property right assignment and transaction cost. So, which is actually a departure from what I proposed earlier. And then transaction cost as the cost of establishing and maintaining property right. To dissect this definition, it has two parts: A, creating a right over a resource which is a necessary condition, and then protecting it from appropriation, which is a sufficient condition. So this definition is obviously different from the cost, zero transaction cost world and having property right. So it is actually now going to be the reverse of the same. That is actually if you have a high, if you want to have a perfect property rights, then you have to have a very high transaction cost involved, and if you have imperfection in property right, it can goes to zero, then no problem. This relationship is crucial because it ignites the central question of what makes the distribution of property right and the rationale of positive transaction cost in the process of any exchange under any social order. Similarly, the distribution of property right is dependent on who bears the cost of transaction, hence determining the value. This also uses the portion of such cost is either sunken or irretrievable, which often makes the transaction cost beyond minimizing it into zero, and it also not advocating any particular set of property right regimes such as private property right or own property right and so on. This approach is having compatibility with viscosity from establishing property right which need further elaboration but not attempting at this point. In a nutshell, the property right transaction cost relation can accommodate a spectrum of property right regime than simply advocating any particular system as a best or efficient. What I want to actually say that, this is actually the theoretical premise I set on. Now, for example, in the development discourse in the first day, we have actually used that Kerala had actually achieved the development from Windows lecture onwards. The discussion is actually centered on that, and that is mentioning that you have actually better education status, health status on all this thing. Now, if you have a property question, I have actually two anecdotes to make. One is actually Royal Proclamation, maybe it is actually in 1870, or later it is actually done by the and the motivation that, if you have a declaration like if you have actually education as actually entitled to the citizens of government. So it is actually acted as an institution which is basically later ignited many to argue for. And it is later in 1860s and 70s and 80s and 90s legitimized many of the maybe struggles to basically get education, and hence since the Royal Proclamation is actually entitled the rights to every citizen, that is the clause, every citizen needs to a constitutional right, then that is in fact entitled the citizens to basically argue for, irrespective of their caste, irrespective of their class characteristics. So that was one sort. And if I am particular about the property issue, then from 1860s onwards only, you have private property started, not elsewhere from. For example, you cannot actually, no property is basically purely privately owned. It is actually state owned. Now, you cannot actually even fell a tree without the permission of the state. So this had actually given, that private rights had actually given from 1870s, 80s, 90s. And that in fact actually made people have not pure private, actually functional rights. So I have actually points. So if there is any question, which is actually entitled people to have investment on other sectors, which is some point is actually held a lot as an institution where you have affirmative action led and the coexistence of people's reaction on that. And that is actually in my mind has led a sort of because it's a large story. I don't want to actually mess up the story if you have this one. Thank you very much.
Three very interesting papers. How to enhance financial inclusion, what is the best way of doing it, then what about dispossession, what is the best way of rehabilitating people who have been dispossessed, and of course I was not very clear on what Siddiq said, I'm sorry. Even though you tried to explain what you said, but I couldn't quite get the link between what you were saying in the beginning and what you said at the end, but perhaps others who have understood me will ask you. That's, I was not quite sure actually what you finally were saying. I mean, is it that if you had no rights over any property, that you are in a situation where you can be in a better position? Like, then you can explain when people ask, because I probably have not quite got it. So now the floor is open. Please, because there was, I think the three presentations actually kept us awake. Though it's very close to lunchtime and very close to just about one-ish, but I thought the papers were really very good. So please ask as many questions, and we have about 20-25 minutes.
This is a question to the person who dealt with the microcredit. And my question is economic liberalization sabotaged the Muhammad Yunus dictum that poverty can be transported to ABC?
Sir, I have a question to Ramakumar sir. Sir, you said that the monitoring and the risk things are very conspicuous when you are giving credit to poor people. So my question is, sir, as a solution, you said the group thing was adopted. Providing microcredit in groups. Why didn't the microcredit enhance the group to a community? Community have more power. Community in the sense religious community or other caste communities. If a community authority have invested with the power of giving or providing, distributing microcredit, it would have resolved the problem of monitoring, and the risk would have been reduced. That's my, what is your comment about that?
There are no studies which says that there is a linkage between the microcredit allocation and the income generation of the poor people. You said that there are no empirical studies. But sir, if we look at other point, like the empowerment that is being instilled by this microcredit, there are vast number of studies which says that such microcredit allocation has resulted in the empowerment. And in all those studies, they have taken income as one of the core variables. Which means that if you look at the study by Jill Williams, if you look at the study by Ashwini and Shulla, you could see that this particular aspect of income is one of the core component of the major dimension of empowerment.
I am Ahmed Kabir. My home is about 1 kilometer away from Balandagan. Okay, I know the people very well there. And whose responsibility is that to protect the environment? Is it for the poor people, government, or NGO, or MNC? And I know that from one of my friends from Shoba, they telling that this is a crisis only. Okay, they will manage the crisis and they will develop not frequently within 5 years. Okay, that is their decision, planning.
One more question to Dr. Manjay Nair. Ma'am, you said that we need to have these assessments of the environmental services. But my question is that if you start valuing a particular product of the nature, then if you put a value for that particular thing, then it will be easy for the people to capture that thing after paying a value that you determine using your methodologies. Wouldn't that increase the encroachment of the environmental resources.
It's like Ravi Shankar being a-
Yeah, because if Ravi Shankar, if you just have a look at the environmental issues that India is facing now, it is because of this valuation methodologies. Because you put a value for this
Yeah,
particular
we
thing.
understand the question.
Hello, my name is Suhail. My question is for Professor Ramakumar, and it's concerning the relative sizes of the SHG bank linkage versus the pure private sector microcredit. What would be the relative sizes, and is the major is it possible for the state bank SHG to take over the entire requirement? Thank you.
My question is to Professor Ramakumar. Could you just comment briefly on this whole business of this argument that subsidies should be targeted? For example, targeted PDS versus universal. I would like him to comment on this argument that subsidies should be targeted. Universal PDS versus.
Thank you. Mine is on concerns Professor Ramakumar. We have a similar experience in my country in issues concerning microfinance and microcredits. How do you handle the issue of defaulters? Defaulters, because we have experience where it is a group or the poor people, they have issues of other needs. So the chances of defaulters, we have very many of them. So how do you defaulters, those who, yeah, so how do you handle them? And also when we have such organized groups, we have experience where they easily accelerate into political dividends. You find that when they default, getting them to justice institutions becomes complicated because of political issue, because they have this public money in those groups. So you find that a group turns into a political party in these days. Then, yeah, my second question is on concerns Dr. Manju about dispossessions. We have this rampant dispossession even in our place. But I tend to think that what dispossession will ever happen. But what matters is post-dispossession livelihood restoration. So, how can you manage development and dispossession?
Let me take one by one. First question was related to whether financial liberalization actually sabotaged Mohammed Yunus's objective. I don't see them as distinct in the first place. My argument here was that Yunus's conception of microcredit fitted very well with the objectives of financial liberalization, and he was a supporter of financial liberalization in the sense that he supported also, as part of it, the deregulation of interest rates. He did not want any regulation of interest rates in Grameen Bank, also in Bangladesh. So it's a bit of, it's not correct actually to say that financial liberalization sabotaged Yunus's objectives, but it should be seen as a weakness of Yunus's worldview itself in the first place. That's my answer to that question. The other question that came was the idea of whether microcredit can move from groups to communities. My answer is in the negative for two reasons. I think this model needs to be preserved in the public domain as a secular and universalist enterprise, and not exclusive domains where vested interests can actually use it for other. There should not be a functionality creep in the running of microcredit. That's how I feel. The experience with community-led microcredit organizations also has not been quite impressive. In Kerala itself, you have very large corruption cases emerging from communities running microcredit agencies, and money being siphoned off for personal and political interest from microcredit organizations started by community organizations. I'm not naming any of them, you are aware. So that is a problem. So the apps, see, even community-based organizations, just because they're community-based organizations, they do not become divorced from the need for capital. And where does that capital come from? That remains a question. The question that I was raising was, when you have a private MFI model, even if in the community framework, right, the demand for capital, as it rises and rises, embeds an element of fragility in the health of that microcredit institution, and that all the cost of that fragility is actually transferred to the poor borrower. And that, in my view, is the major problem with that model. And that is absent in the public model because you don't have to show higher profits every time. That's the point I was making. Right? So it's not whether who is running it. It's about whether you're a private MFI-led model or you're a public MFI. That's the difference that I want to underline. The question of empowerment, it's very important. And I don't see the indicator that I took in my argument was income poverty. Right? Now, I'm not disputing that there might have been different forms of empowerment that resulted from intended or unintended from being a member of the microcredit group. I'm not disputing that at all. But regarding the question of income, you actually said at the end of your question that it might also have increased incomes in the process of empowerment. That's what that part is what I dispute, in the sense that studies actually show that, in fact, scholars like Naila Kabir and others have argued there could actually be a strong disempowering effect in microcredit because of a fall of incomes. Right? In the following sense, if you take she speaks about in her book, she speaks about two effects of microcredit which studies cannot quite figure out. Right? Which is, the first is called the displacement effect. Okay? The displacement effect means because the provision of microcredit allows some people to form a micro enterprise. Okay, given that the market is stagnant, it may actually be destroying another enterprise elsewhere, which you don't know. You may be usurping the market of another group or another enterprise where jobs may be lost. It's a possibility, conceptually, if you look at it, right? And which these studies cannot adequately comprehend. Number one. The other is the question of client failure. The point is when micro enterprises fail, the basic problem is this. This is not Kabir, but my own. But the thing is, if you have an interest rate of 24 to 36%, right? And if you have look at a medium-sized industrial group, what is the rate of return on their investment? Not more than 15%. 15% is considered a very fair rate of return from an enterprise, from a medium-sized industry, right? You are expecting a small micro enterprise to break even. If you have to pay an interest of 24 to 36%, you have to break even at 124% of your investment. Right? In other words, you are actually asking for very ambitious and unrealistic rate of return from a small enterprise funded with small amount of capital. So the risk of failure or the risk of default is very high if you keep the interest rate so high. But then you may ask, why are default rates so low, right? It's a very simple answer, because there is every serious study on microcredit has actually shown that there is a problem of edge cycles that emerge. In the sense, you have a Grameen Bank loan or you have some other SHG loan, you want to repay it, the time has come to repay, the guy will come and humiliate you in front of your neighbors, in front of your peers, right? So you want to avoid that humiliation, so you go to another SHG and borrow another loan to repay the loan of this SHG. Okay? Or you go to another money lender and take a loan of approximately the same interest rate to repay the loan of this SHG. These instances have been very common. If you look at the instance of Andhra Pradesh from 2006 to 2012, right, when very large number of suicides by SHG borrowers took place in the Krishna district and so on, this was the core problem. I have documented the large number of suicide cases and the reasons for these suicides. I can read out if time permits from the quotes from newspaper. What actually shows is every time it's the inability to repay a loan, right, which ended up in harassment, right, and ultimate suicide of that. Also, in many cases, it was actually a second round or third round loan which they took to repay a first round SHG loan, which actually ended up they being cornered at that level. In other words, my point here is high interest rate constantly pushes you into a corner with respect to your ability to repay. And that, you're at a precipice as the repayment time comes. That actually is the most important problem that I see in that model of credit provision. Right? And companies have this constant urge to ensure maximum repayment because they have to keep the profits high for other reasons. And these studies actually do not consider this quite well. The size of the public and private, the relative size of public and private is actually differs across states. If you look at Andhra Pradesh, you will see private outnumbering the public. If you look at Kerala, you will see the public outnumbering the private. So it's a sort of mixed picture that you have. But overall, the question you asked whether public can actually meet the requirement. That's what the last part of your question was. My answer is in the affirmative. Yes. It's just that kind of favorable policy for that kind of disbursement should actually emerge. That is all. The question of targeting of subsidies in figures because of lack of that actually provides me with an interesting topic for my afternoon intervention. I'll keep it for that. Default in private MFIs and I've answered that question about default. The default, as a result, what you have is default rates remain very high, harassment ensues, and unfortunate incidents like I don't know from where that question came. I forgot. As default rates rise because of the inability of borrowers to repay loans, the private companies who have to ensure low default rates, because you have to show your investors good results, they have to somehow ensure repayment of the loan, and that leads to multiple forms of harassment of the household. And it is this harassment that led to the Andhra Pradesh government in India to enact a microcredit law in their assembly, a state level law, which actually put a ceiling on how much margins can be. So it's put something like a 26% ceiling on interest rates in microcredit. And for that one reason, because a public law came and put a 26% ceiling on interest rate, many microfinance companies collapsed because they were charging 60% and they could remain viable only at 60%. Right? So that's the problem with that model that I wanted to highlight. And whether it is India or some other country, that economics remains the same.
Thank you for your questions. Now, first was on whose responsibility it should be to protect the person who comes from very near to Andhra. I'm very happy that one person is here. It's barely 1 kilometer from Ernakulam. And you see how different is the place, Ernakulam town and this Valandakad island. Now, this is not the case with Valandakad alone. We have visited Thrissur where Shobha builders they have acquired around 400 acres of wetlands and they have constructed massive residential colonies, and the people there face a lot of problems regarding water scarcity, all sorts of environmental pollution. I hope you remember the incident when the owner of Shobha, he killed the security guard there. It was the same place that we visited. Now in Valandakad, now they are using all types of policies, carrot and stick policies to lure people in order to.
Inverter or something more?
I think you can hear me. Now Shobha, around 1 month back when we visited there, the Shobha builders, they were able to succeed in taking 2 or 3 people to there.
Just one sec, let's get back to order. I just got a little worried because of this strange sound. Stop now. So, please carry on.
Okay, now these people, they were successful in taking 2 or 3 families to the flats that they have constructed in Palakkad and Thrissur, and they are luring these people. Now see, this is what is development, and we come stay in your island, you can come and settle down here. And now there is a divide and rule policy that is going on there. And all the local leaders are being bribed there. And you said that Shobha is very adamant that they will acquire this land within 5 acres and they will construct that. And we can expect what we had with incident in Chennai, the flooding. Ernakulam is a different geographical area where if you have flooding, now there are wetlands or all these resources, water resources, you can accommodate this. Now once it is restricted and once it is turning into a conflict situation, now it will be a very difficult position for you. It's a responsibility of the people, it's a responsibility of the villagers, it's a responsibility of NGOs, civil society, the government, everybody to protect this system. And I would like to add by commenting upon Neela's question. So you were asking now, if you say that now this is a value that is being created by the environment, won't there be much encroachment? I would like to disagree with you, because these people are encroaching this land, not utilize the environmental values. So they want respect the environmental values. The environmental values are nutrient cycling, water purification, carbon sequestration, which can prevent global warming. These are the environmental values. Now they want to destroy the whole thing and they want to construct it into IT parks, residential colonies, etc. Now, fully in economics, we say we have to tell to the society loudly that now this environment is having some value. It needs to be protected. Now, otherwise, now only because some environmentalists and some economists are now raising the value, now telling the public that this is having some value, we need to value it, that now such sort of a change has happened. Otherwise, no, I don't know how that is possible. I agree with your answer. Now, second is another one. Now, my friend from Jeffrey was asked on the post-displacement livelihood. Now, the Galapadam is the issue where we have restricted all these situations. The state acquired all the property, and there was large-scale construction activities going on. And we can consult with Shamsi, who has done a very good piece of research, is sitting there on post-displacement, and we still see that after 5 years, the people they have not been compensated with the market price, and they have been given some piece of land where they are not able to live. They are facing a lot of environmental problems now. They don't have a place to dispose this place. This is the situation. So it is better to prevent. Look into the situation pre-displacement or the initial point, and then we can think about the things. We always speak about the livelihood issues. Now other issues we are not taking into consideration. We need to focus on that. And I have some questions which sir has written. And one is, we have a mathematical formula to assess ecosystem services provided by a particular ecological factor, and how do you add that to the land value? Now, this is the issue that I have been raising. Now, land is valued only in terms of market price. And we need to include device and methodology. We have methodologies by which we can value ecosystem services, and that is very complex also, because all these services, regulating, provisioning, supporting, etc., require different economical applications, and it's highly complex, but this should be included in the value. And once we try to concentrate on that, other than the market price, this is to be popularized, and there will be change for that. And a rare beetle was sold for 2,000 yens in Japan. How an endangered species can, that is what I have been speaking about, the different services that this ecosystem provides, the biodiversity. We need to value that, the cultural services that we get from that, and that is why it is priced. Okay, thank you so much.
I'm sorry that the presentation went over. So actually, it is not like that. Actually, the premise which I was setting the entire discussion is normally in the very typical neoclassical theory, we list all the other elements from society out. You make your model and you try to explain things, but basically that is incoherent. In order to explain the real world, or whatever the entity is, or whatever the reality, you have to reconstruct your model. You have to, in that, you have to actually bring different things into, in that actually endeavor, the institutional economics emerged, then law and economics emerged, many sub-disciplines emerged. In that outset, what I tried is actually the institution, for example, the law or any sort of any legal affirmation or statement, that itself, that is actually it is non-individual. It is actually not a particular individual. It's actually from the state or some third party. This is actually called the third party intervention. Now, my point is actually, if you have third party interventions, then you have actually a different economics. And that different economics cannot be basically explained by the traditional economics, where you have to reconstruct your model. And that is actually the premise which I spoke about, the entire thing. Because, for instance, if you want to basically speak about development, and we always try to speak about the outcomes, but the premises of that outcome has to be basically evaluated, and it has to be basically connected, and it has to be theorized. So in that context only, my point makes some relevance and some sense. Otherwise, it doesn't. Because in the original neoclassical model, where, as I referred, that it never speaks about any rights, any sort of thing. But that is not the case in reality. If you have some sort of right in terms of, for example, use right, or you have to actually make use of the resource. We speak about transaction of commodity or transaction of right. We only speak about transaction of commodity, but we never speak about transaction of rights. Because transaction of commodity itself preceded by rights, which is actually an institution. So you have to actually have a hell lot of complexity which is actually involved before even you just get into the very idea of transaction. But that is actually out of your context, and in that context only, so that is actually, it brings positive cost in the society, positive, I have actually not put myself completely out of the neoclassical. What I was actually in the presentation, I was stood within the neoclassical sense, and then I said that what is actually the discomfort, which in order to explain the empirical world. So that is the first part of the story, and that is the thing. Then you can actually, then only you can basically explain the real world and go back to the empirics and theorize what is actually the real empirics looks like. Not from the neoclassical, typical neoclassical theory, which is actually completely fails to basically explain whatever real world empiricism is.
So we've really just one or two things I wanted to say, which one was that this public SHG bank linkage, where the public sector banks are playing an important role. Now, though the way you put it, of course, it's much above the private thing, but in Kerala, the Kudumbashri groups are facing the problem of not being able to access loans from these banks. So that's one thing which you have to keep in mind, that the banks themselves may be driven by the financial deregulation type of a thing, where they're not. So that's one thing you should keep in mind. And the other thing which I wanted to say was that was a basic question. I don't want you to answer it now. But can we agree to selling off bits of land because somebody is able to pay the price which you estimate in terms of all your ecological system of goods and services? Can one then say, okay, so long as Shobha is able to pay all that, maybe they are entitled to take that land. So that is one thing which is probably what was worrying her, and what always keeps worrying me, that if Sri Sri Ravi Shankar was able to pay that fight, he didn't even pay that, and he was able to do all that. But of course his devotees all tell me that the Ganga looks much better now than the Yamuna, sorry. The Yamuna looks much better now. And the other thing, of course, is of all these big corporates who are now defaulting. I mean, nobody talks about that as much as catching hold of these poor self-help group wala women who are not able to repay their loans and have to commit suicide. But nothing much is happening to the big defaulters which now are coming up. So these are certain things which we have to keep in mind in the alternative. That what do we do about these big defaulters? How do we catch them? And what do we do about helping out the poor women who are really not able to pay perhaps interest for a few months? So thank you very much for a very, very interesting session. And thank you for the organizers for asking me to chair this session. Thanks. The session is over and lunch is served outside.
I would like to call upon Anamika to propose a vote of thanks.
Good afternoon everyone. The last and final section is over, and it's my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. And firstly, I would like to thank Madam Ridu Ethan for effectively chairing the session and ensuring the time limits. Thank you, ma'am. Professor R. Ramakumar for showing the important space microfinance have in changing the poor in India, and aptly pointing out the model which will actually help us in sending the poor to the museum. Thank you, sir. Poverty to the museum. And our dear Manshah for her important work and sharing with us your findings and opinions today on the urgent need for an alternative methodology in assessing the cost of development-induced environmental disposition. Thank you, ma'am. And Sidhu sir, we all know every day he comes with a package of new ideas and thoughts on different fields of economics. Since we are not able to thank him after the regular classes for the brain exercise he's given, I use this opportunity to thank him for his enthusiasm and finally for the energetic participation of all of you. And as ma'am said, time is served, and I request you to be present here on 2 p.m. to attend the 2:30 p.m. to attend the panel discussion on the necessity of development alternative. Thank you.